Right, this is slightly intimidating because I do not see any of you. You're like shrouded in darkness, but as long as people can hear and see, that's good. So, as Lakris said, my name is Mikhail Fiadotau. I teach at TalTech University. We have a program on learning games, college to learning games, and we also teach bachelor level courses in game design. And I teach some of those courses, but also I make games outside of my day job from time to time. Some of them, like the missing parts of Maria Gwozdek, you can play on Steam. Others you will hopefully at some point be able to play on Steam, and I'll plug them next time, maybe. But for now, I wanted to talk about a topic that in the courses that we teach, I find we don't actually have time to address enough, and that I think is still important. So that's one opportunity to discuss. So let's talk about game feel. Basically, the observation that I've had over the years of teaching game-related things at the university is when we discuss game design and game development and we talk about how to make a good game and we get into the question of what actually makes a game a good game, we largely talk about either gameplay-related things, so whether it be how do you design an engaging core loop, which is a pivotal, crucial question, or how do you come up with new innovative mechanics that are fun and experimental and cool and surprise people in interesting ways, or how do you do a difficulty curve that Shen is going to be talking about that's in a couple minutes, well, in 20 minutes, or how do you approach it from a level design perspective and maximize the value of the game mechanics by creating actual environmental content to use them around. Or if not that, we might talk about narrative elements as well. So we could focus on how do you design an engrossing story. A good game, for some of us, maybe just a walk-in simulator that's not necessarily super complex mechanically, but it has a nice way of delivering an interesting plot. Or it can be an interesting set of characters, or it can be world building, or maybe the game just looks cool. Maybe it has a unique aesthetic style, or it's amazingly photorealistic. Some people pay attention to that sort of thing. Maybe the audio design is good. All of these are well and good, but the thing that we don't seem to talk about as much, that maybe we should be talking about more, is does the game feel nice to control? Does it feel nice to interact with using your controller, mouse, keyboard, touchscreen, steering wheel, whatever else you use to control the game? Does the game respond nice to player input? And this is the thing that we call game feel. Or some people call basically the same thing game juice. So as far as I'm concerned, the two terms are interchangeable. I'm going to stick with feel because it just sounds a bit more professional somehow. There's a book about this. So if you decide that you want to learn more about the subject, I'll recommend it later. But the point that I want to make for now is game mechanics do not determine whether a game is satisfying to play or not, or game mechanics alone don't determine it. Because you can have the same set of mechanics that end up feeling completely different in different contexts, depending on other factors, right? A game can be very clever mechanically, but if you are not making good use of those mechanics, it may still feel frustrating, boring, or just awfully mediocre. But also, I want to emphasize that when we talk about game feel, there's no real single way to do it right or wrong. There's multiple approaches, multiple solutions to the same problem. So all of the suggestions and all of the considerations that I'm going to be talking about, I'm not suggesting that there's necessarily the way to go. It's more that these are things to think about. As a case in point, if you look at the two best-known classic platformer games, supposedly, of all time, one being Super Mario, the other one being Sonic the Hedgehog. Oh, I forgot it has sound. Let me mute it briefly. They have very similar mechanics, not identical mechanics. Sonic can do certain things Mario can't, and the other way around. Sonic is not big on mushrooms, for example. But despite having identical mechanics, the feel of the game is quite different. Hopefully you can tell from the video, right? Sonic is a game that's a lot more about speed of movement, right? It's a lot more about like long stretches of fluid running, jumping. In fact, when you run into something and it kind of interrupts your flow, that's kind of annoying. It's also a game about failing repeatedly, restarting the level until you've memorized the level layout enough that you can perform sort of flawlessly. Whereas Mario was a lot more take your time, look at the things around you, respond to the obstacles. It's also fluid in its own way, right? It has a nice kind of sense of physics. But it's a very different game feel in terms of how you go around navigating the game, right? And that's basically to say that there's different ways of doing game feel, even in different contexts, or in a similar context rather, and they can be equally valid. Now, the book that I was going to plug, and I forgot which slide it was on, that's the book. It's called Game Feel, A Game Designer's Guide to Virtual Sensation by Steve Swink. It's not an easy one to get your hands on in Estonia, but I'm sure there's ways of finding PDFs somewhere in the ether if you're interested. It's a book that very specifically looks at a very particular kind of game. It's mostly concerned with action-based games. It has a lot of examples from platformers and racing games and these kind of things. And most materials about game feel that you'll find on the internet are also in that category. But that's not the only way of applying game feel. I think it applies more broadly, and I'll try to bring up a couple of examples that are not necessarily action-based, just to highlight that point. But basically, if I try to distill the sort of main considerations from the book, plus some additional thoughts, I guess, on top of that, these are the 6 sort of layers that Swing discusses in the context of game feel. So these are the things that you need to consider, or you probably should consider, if you want the game to have a certain consistent game feel. And let me talk you through these individual layers one by one, starting with input. So, input, I guess I don't need to define input, but that's his definition. What the player does to communicate their intent to the system. There's a variety of different ways to play video games, right? Depending on, say, what controller you're using. It may be, are you pressing buttons on your keyboard or your controller? Are you interacting with a touchscreen, swiping, tapping, that sort of thing? Do you use a gamepad with a joystick? Do you use maybe Microsoft Kinect type thing where you just physically move and the game responds to that? Do you use a Nintendo DS-like stylus to draw things? VR, where you just look around and the game responds to that? All of these feel different, and all of these change how a game can be perceived. And input is obviously a very certain central consideration. This is one of the few elements of game feel that we do actually talk quite a bit when we discuss game design. One of the most annoying things for me personally, as a pet peeve that people do in game jams, is say having a keyboard-controlled game where when you go to the game menu to pause the game or something, now you have suddenly to use the mouse, which is not used elsewhere in the gameplay. These are the kind of user experience considerations, right, that we consider a lot. And one of the basic considerations is, for the vast majority of games, you want the game feel to be intuitive, right? You don't want the player to have to think about the control scheme at all. Ideally, they're not actually focusing or like cognitively processing the fact that they are using a controller. Ideally, we want them to forget that there's like this artificial layer of there's some kind of thing that you need to be doing in order to control the game. We just want them to be in the game mentally. Which is to say that when you have a control scheme like this, that's quite difficult to achieve, because a lot of the time, the player, unless they're really hardcore and really well familiar with the game, will find themselves sort of in a panicky, which one of these buttons is not going to kill me, right, type situations. So figuring out ways to make the input as intuitive and as straightforward as possible is one of the basic considerations. But also, another consideration is, what is the kind of controller and what is the kind of control scheme that aligns well with the content of what you're doing in the game? Does anyone know of a certain Japanese franchise called Typing of the Dead? Not that I can see you, but I think I see one hand, a couple hands. So it's a game, it's a shooter game. It used actually to be a zombie shooter called House of the Dead, and the developers at some point thought, wouldn't it be fun if instead of actually like shooting and aiming, we had the player type words to shoot the zombie? No reason, just to see how that works out. Roughly speaking, this is what the game looks like. Zombies running around, type the words, kill the zombies. Not a particularly serious game, but weirdly fun. This is the main reason there was a keyboard controller for PlayStation 2 at some point. This is the control scheme the game is meant for. However, there's other ways people are trying to play the game. If anyone has a Steam Deck, you can technically play it on it, thanks to this little community layout. So 2 trackpads. You can see the person showcasing the control scheme they came up with is not doing the greatest job. Now the zombie reached them, because it's a freaking hassle to type those words. It's a very blatant, it's a very obvious example that I went for, but the point I'm trying to make is consider your control scheme. What is the thing that works with your mechanics without making it frustrating, distracting, and so on? So I guess input is largely self-explanatory. The next bit, to some extent as well, the response bit, that refers to how does the system react to the player's input. So when you press the key, when you move the controller, move around in a Kinect-controlled game like dance or whatever it is that you do, what does the game then do in response, right? And a lot of these are physics considerations, game physics, right? Like the weight of the objects, the amount of inertia that you have, how much does your momentum carry you after you stopped pressing the key, how responsive the system is. Can you, for example, by holding the jump button longer or shorter, adjust the height of the jump? How sensitive the system is. I guess that was the jump example, but also like how fast does the game respond to a different input? If you change something halfway, how fast will the system respond? So these are the kind of considerations. Again, this doesn't just apply to action games, but I guess it's particularly obvious in those kinds of examples. Let me give you a real-life example. Does anyone play tennis out of curiosity? You don't have to. It's sort of self-explanatory. The physics of the objects, the inertia and momentum, those kinds of things are what make tennis the competitive sport that it is. But there's other ways available if you wanted to play tennis. I personally find that other one to be kind of more fun looking. Maybe not as challenging, but just like physically, something from that little clip seems a lot more satisfying than the running around after a tiny ball that keeps bouncing away from you. That's what I mean with responsiveness, and that is something that with video games you need to consider a lot. So let me give you 2 examples. I just went for like the most bare bones stripped down games. So this is one called Love. It was a giveaway on the Epic Games Store a couple years back. It's a hardcore platformer, pixel perfect, precision platformer, very minimalistic as you can see. If you can tell from the little clip here, there's very little inertia, right? The moment you stop pressing the jump button, you basically sort of stop running. You don't sort of slide on a platform like Mario does, for example. And this is important because for this kind of game, it's literally pixel perfect. To get it like 1 pixel to the left, to the right, that makes a major difference. It's a frustrating game, and so it has to be very precise with the input. Now, let me show you another minimalist platformer. I don't know if anyone's run into this one. This one is called N. It's a game about a ninja, I think, who has 90 seconds to live, which can be extended by collecting gold. It's also very precise and responsive, but it has much more floaty sort of physics, right? The jump trajectory takes you a lot further. You can cross the entire screen in 2-3 jumps. A lot of the momentum is something you can slightly adjust halfway, but you also need to sort of consider the duration of your jump. You have to be very precise about how you're trying to land on all of these things. So again, 2 platformer games, very different game feel. And that is basically the responsiveness consideration. Now, the thing that brings these things together is what Swink refers to as context. So a lot of it is about level design. How do you create a physical space that allows the player to utilize those mechanics in a meaningful way, where they can actually feel good and they can fulfill the function that you have for them, while also having this kind of response that you intended in terms of game physics. So an example that I had a second ago, this game feels very good to play. It's been around since 2004. There's still a community of people like actively making levels for it and stuff, which tells you something. But it only feels good to play if the level design actually supports this kind of floaty physics that the game is known for. If you have a level that looks something like this, like that does not feel fun to play at all because you have no opportunity in the game to sort of actually utilize the physics, right? It doesn't feel terrible per se to be playing those kinds of levels, but it doesn't actually take advantage of what the game is meant to be doing. And hence, context is really important. This is another one, if you like frustrating games and you haven't checked out this one somehow, Guessing Over It with Bennett Foddy is a game about climbing up and up and up and falling down a lot, sometimes all the way down and losing all of your progress. It's a deliberately frustrating game, and it can only work as a game if you have this kind of environment that's slightly diagonal, going upwards the whole time, has ledges of some kind for the player to grab onto. It has a very specific sort of mechanic input to it as well, so it already has kind of a crazy-ish game feel. And to have this idea of like you can actually slide down all the way, you need to be very careful about how you design these environments as well, right? So if this was just a series of platforms, sort of like Mario style, it wouldn't really work like that. There is another game that does that called Jump King, but even though the concept is similar, it feels quite different. So knowing what your mechanics are, knowing what sort of response do you want the game to produce, thinking in level design terms and thinking of how do I maximize it within the game is a really big consideration. Another one that Twink talks about in the book is polish, and that is something that basically sounds like just an extra thing, make it look nice, make it feel nice, but it can actually sell the game feel to the player by emphasizing the important parts, the responsive parts, the interesting parts. Here's a game some people may be familiar with. A couple of yays. Broforce is the game. So if you look at what's happening here, it's a platformer, there's a lot of shooting involved, and when they're shooting, stuff flies around. I maybe should have given you a trigger warning, violence, but we can see that now. And inside that game, basically, game feel is maybe one of the things that really sets it apart. There's other things involved as well, but like it feels very visceral, right? It feels very physical what's going on in the game. Because if we zoom in a little bit, you can see when there's an explosion, there's a screen shake that makes it feel, and the controller shakes, I think, as well. All of these particles flying around. The game really kind of maximizes this feeling of sort of being there, directly involved in that kind of combat situation, right? Things feel very action-y, action movie-y, even though it's a fundamentally simple 2D platformer, right? So this kind of thing is what polish refers to. Let me give you a different example that's not from an action game for a change. So this is a game that I like quite a lot. It's called Omni Bullet. It's not particularly well known. I think it deserves better, not just because its creators were in my game design course, but because it's an interesting puzzle thing. Where's the sound? There should be sound. It's real quiet. That's unfortunate, because the sound is a big part of it. Okay. You don't necessarily need to understand what's happening in the game mechanically. It helps if you do, but basically for the context of the game, this is a conveyor belt. You're trying to sort of charge those batteries by constructing a conveyor thing. And it creates this kind of rhythmic effect of different things make different sounds when they're hit. There's also little particle effects when there's collisions. There's when you make a mistake, it flashes red. There's a lot of these things that it's a puzzle game. It's not particularly a genre that's known for maximizing game feel, but in this context, it actually does a very interesting job of that, right? Maximizing sort of the visceral, the physical part of the experience. Two more considerations. Metaphor. So how do you actually frame what the player does in the game? What kind of feelings does this evoke? For example, these two games are fairly similar mechanically. The second one, you're not overtaking your enemies, so it's not exactly a racing game in that sense, but largely the mechanics are very similar. But by having these different settings in these different contexts, they already feel quite different. My favorite example of this is, so this is Wolfenstein 3D, one of the earliest 3D shooters around. I wonder if anyone knows what this is. This is Super 3D Noah's Ark. It's a Christian, non-violent game made a year after Wolfenstein 3D using the same engine. The premise is you're Noah, you built a giant ship to escape from the Great Flood, and the animals are running around rampant, and you're trying to put them to sleep by shooting purportedly food at them. Also, one of the close combat one is just you feeding them something. Mechanically, it's exactly the same game. It's exactly the same engine. They just changed the Nazis for the animals. But it feels quite different because they framed it in a completely different way. It's a different metaphor. It's not a great game, but it's a great example of how to repackage this idea. And the metaphor doesn't have to be literal. It's a metaphor, I mean. So this is a game called Pilgrims by Amanita Design. Whoops. So in the game Pilgrims, it's what, if it came out 10 years before it did, it would have been a point-and-click adventure. They found an interesting way to frame it. They made it into a card game, which is still, you're pretty much interacting with items and solving puzzles in the game, but making it look as cards and making the cards kind of look a little bit sort of physical. You pull out the card of the deck, it materializes the object on the level. When you collect an object, it then sort of pops up as a card. All of that stuff gives it a very different game feel from a traditional pixel hunting with your mouse kind of point-and-click adventure game. The final one that Swing talks about that kind of ties it in together a little bit is the rule set. So longer period objectives that give meaning to control and mastery. What do I mean by that? I'll give you just one example. This one is a platformer as well. So this is Celeste. Hopefully a lot of people know this game. It's, in terms of level design, probably one of my favorite ones ever. It's a game about climbing a mountain. It's a really difficult platformer with a lot of optional challenges and stuff. And there's a consistent theme of sort of you're climbing a mountain, you're trying to get to the top of this mountain. You're going largely diagonally, sort of from the bottom left to the top right. And the mechanics of the game sometimes, well, the mechanics are consistent, but the game feel can change depending on the environment. So this one is, for example, very windy, and then your jump is very limited. It's not floaty at all. Your movement speed feels quite restricted as well. But the thing that keeps it consistent is the concept of you're climbing a mountain across all these different contexts. The game physics may change, the game feel may slightly change, but it feels consistent because it's given this bigger sort of narrative theme. So these are the kind of considerations of the game feel may be different individually from moment to moment, but as long as there's a consistent reason and consistent kind of setup that explains it, that's okay. So real quick, some final considerations for if you're trying to take this into account when designing your prototypes. The basic thing with game feel is you identify what your core mechanic is, you identify what the interesting thing about it is supposed to be, and you just got to make it feel good. You maximize that. If you're making a game like V, which is all about flipping gravity, now you're at the ceiling, now you're on the floor, now you're on the ceiling again, you have to make that feel good because that's the thing the player will be doing a bunch of times. There can also be an emotional factor to it. So if you're making a game about free flying, recently I've been playing Mikhail and the Witch's Mountain, you want to create a game that gives the player a sense of freedom that feels nice to fly around in, right? If you're making a horror game where you're being chased and you want to make it claustrophobic, then you probably want to have sort of fast bursts of movement, quick looking behind you, and maximizing that from a game feel perspective will improve the emotional aspect of it. Consider your target audience. What do they want? What do they expect? Have they played on this platform before? Are they hardcore platformer players who are used to a certain control scheme? If you're using a different one, why would you want to disrupt that? Will it cause confusion? play around just to see what happens, right? It's a longer story, but Space Invaders, the famous arcade game, is known for inventing the difficulty curve they didn't really mean to, right? It's just that the game speeds up, the fewer aliens are left, because it just takes less computing power to process a smaller amount of enemies, so it runs faster. But that was the masterstroke, right? That created the game feel that the game is known for, and that subsequently pretty much every game under the sun has mimicked. And finally, you can't really get it right, even if in your head it makes total sense. You have to playtest. You'll have to probably notice things are not going to plan a lot of the time, and then you iterate, and you playtest, and you iterate, and you playtest, and you continue doing that until you run out of time or will to live, hopefully the former. And that's my talk for today, so thank you very much, and I'm happy to chat with you if you have questions later.